Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Statistics Solutions Chapter 5 webinar. We have a co-host on who is putting in the chat box now some links to resources, our website, which contains dissertation resources. It will also have an archive that includes this webinar as well as other webinars from the past. So that's there for you. All right. If you haven't, we'll have a question and answer session at the end where I'll invite you to ask questions and I'll try to answer them. If you do have questions along the way as we proceed, you can jot them down. You can put them in the chat box or the question and answer box. That's fine. I just won't get to them until the end. So I think that's it. So let's get started. So if you're at the chapter 5 or you're about to be, congratulations, you're near the end. If you're just kind of sitting in looking ahead, that's fine too. Just get kind of a sense of what's in store. So yeah, the chapter 5, it's good news if you're here. You are near the end. You're not at the end yet, but you're close, right? The chapter 5, just to kind of pull back and talk about its place in the overall dissertation, is where you discuss, interpret, you talk about your findings. Basically, you have in the previous chapter your results, you've presented what you found, and now it's time to talk about them, which is what chapter 5 is about. There's also, I know a lot of people want to rush the chapter 5, and I get that, because you're at the end. Number one, you're kind of, you may be just over the whole process, in the sense that, dissertation is long. It takes a lot of work, perseverance, a lot of ups and downs. So it's understandable that you, after all this time, you want to get it done, and you want to, move on to the next chapter of your life or whatever. So that's completely understandable. Also, some people just don't, they don't want to pay for another semester. That's understandable too. Just watch that though, kind of check yourself a little bit if it's really necessary to kind of rush through it if you're in a great rush, because sometimes that can be counterproductive. If you rush the 5 and you give it a really short treatment or really insufficient treatment, I mean, that can backfire on you too. You may end up needing to do extra work. You may need to have to rewrite it. So you are near the end, you're kind of going on the downhill slope, but, kind of avoid that. I mean, you can be, insistent on getting it done, but as far as rushing and doing a subpar job, that's something you want to check yourself against. And it is your results, and you're discussing your results, so that's kind of important. Also, there are other steps after the chapter 5, so don't just think like, I'm going to be done with chapter 5, it's all over. Well, it's not. I mean, you're close. As you know, your chair and your committee is still going to have to go over the chapter 5 and, approve it. They're, probably going to have comments, and you're going to have to work on it more after you submit it. Then usually schools have something called a form and style check, which is after all the chapters are done, it goes to somebody and they check the formatting, right, against the school's, formatting template, right, to make, your margins and your headers, and they check to make sure it's APA compliant. So, and then I think there's one final review after that, a small review. And then, of course, you have your final defense. So there are steps after the chapter 5. So when you're kind of planning, the end, being complete, just keep those extra other steps in mind. Okay. So these are typical contents with chapter 5. Introduction, interpretation of findings. Sometimes the section itself is called the discussion. Limitations, implications for practice, recommendations for further research, summary. I always advise students to get a hold of their school's template. I mean, I'm sure if you're at chapter 5, you've already have it and have been following it. But I just want to emphasize that because, you know, the template is going to give you usually your, you know, the header titles, usually descriptions of what they want in the sections. So always follow your school's template, but this is pretty safe general contents of what chapter 5s include. You know, always they have some discussion of the findings, and there's usually some discussion of limitations, and there's always some connections to you know, further research and to practice. But again, just, you know, stick to what your template says. If you don't have a template, you can kind of use a general one like this, or sometimes your school or your chair will be happy to provide an example of what they want you to follow. All right. So chapter 5 starts with the introduction. And in this case, the introduction, like introductions in other chapters, you want to reorient the reader, right? Let's orient the reader about what's going on in this chapter, what you're going to be doing. And that starts with, it's just helpful to restate the purpose of your study, right? And when you restate the purpose, and this goes for anywhere you talk about the purpose in your dissertation, you can restate your purpose verbatim. In fact, you should. It's like your research questions. They don't change. Your research questions, once they're set and approved and, you know, you're moving forward, your research questions don't change, or they shouldn't. Same with your purpose. So restate your purpose. Again, you can restate it verbatim, but a small caveat: the research questions and the purpose statement are really the only time you get to essentially copy and paste something, because copying and pasting other parts is frowned upon. So restate your purpose. Remind the reader of the importance of your study and the need for your study. This will probably be like reminding them of the research problem, you know, why it was necessary to conduct your study. And you can preview contents of the chapter if you want. You know, this chapter will include sections on you know, discussion of the findings, recommendations for practice, recommendations for research. So the introduction, not too long, probably less than a page. Okay, and generally, you know, all chapters are different. I've seen really long chapter 5s, really short ones. General ballpark though for length for chapter 5s, 10 to 20 pages. So they're not real long chapters. You know, quantitative chapters quantitative studies tend to be, the chapter 5s tend to be a little shorter, probably like 10 to 12 pages, maybe 8 to 12. Qualitative chapter 5s may tend to be a little longer, you know, maybe 10 to 15. So I'd say, you know, anywhere from 8 to 15 pages is kind of the sweet spot for these chapters. Okay, that doesn't mean you can't have longer ones, of course. But if you find it going on too long, you know, check that. There may be places where you can kind of trim it down. Okay, so after the introduction, the first section is called interpretation of the findings. So what you want to do here is, interpretation is kind of a little misleading. It sounds like you're going to kind of be personally interpreting, you know, what your results mean. Not really, a little bit, but mostly it's you want to relate your findings to the major findings of previous research that you can find back in your chapter 2. So that's the link between the chapter 5 and the chapter 2. Right, so you want to kind of, so the best way to handle this section is the use of subheaders, right? And for quantitative studies, you can usually just use your research questions or your hypotheses, right? So research question 1, you know, you can restate the research question. You know, provide you know, the finding for that research question. And you don't need a lot of statistics in this chapter. The statistics appear in the chapter 4, right? So you don't, this is a very statistics light or even statistics free chapter. It's really kind of plain spoken. So, just kind of summarize your finding for research question 1, for example. And then you want to bring in some of the major findings about that, which you studied for research question 1 from chapter 2. And what you're doing is you're starting a discussion that relates what you found to findings of previous literature. And what you want to do is talk about whether your findings confirm those findings, whether they don't confirm those findings, or maybe whether they add something new or different or novel. And then you can make kind of conclusions based on that, right? So if your findings are confirming previous research, that you can make a conclusion about whatever it was you were studying there, right? If if your findings don't confirm previous research, well, that suggests a degree of inconclusiveness, right? If your findings show something new, that's worth mentioning too. So have a discussion about your findings in relation to previous research, noting the similarities, difference, whether it supports or not. And that's kind of the idea here for, if it's your first research question. If it's qualitative, you're going to subsection the section out by themes, right? Because usually qualitative findings take the form of themes. So theme 1, lay out your theme. Talk a little bit about it, what it means, just kind of summarize it. And then again, same thing, bring in previous research on that topic, whatever you studied, and discuss your research in relation to that previous research, noting if it supports or doesn't support. Okay, and that's kind of what they're looking for here. Then you would go on to research question 2 or to theme 2 if it's qualitative, and do the same thing. If you have 4 themes, do it for each theme. Same for the quant, for your research questions. And that makes it really reader friendly and also writer friendly, right? Because when you start talking about your results and previous literature, if you kind of lump it all in together, it's going to get confusing, right? So that's why it's best to take it by research question or by hypothesis. Same with qualitative. If you start talking about all your themes kind of together, you're going to get lost. And if you're lost, your reader's going to be lost. So it's just helpful to chunk this section out by the themes of the research questions. Okay, I think I covered everything here. Okay, right. And again, going back to your chair providing you examples, obviously make use of your resources. Your resources are things like this webinar, any kind of support from your school. Sometimes they have writing centers, just any kind of resource that you can take advantage of, do. But sometimes there's just no substitute when you sit down to write than a good example, right? So if you have an example from your school, or you can obtain one if you don't already have one, an approved dissertation from your school in a study that's close to yours, look at it, right? Just see how people have handled this section. Okay, and all the sections, frankly. Limitations. Sometimes, again, consult your school's template. Sometimes they want a section, a complete section on limitations. Sometimes you can just fold the limitations into the interpretation of the finding section at the end here. But either way, you need to talk a little bit about the weaknesses and shortcomings of your study. So probably in chapter 1 or in chapter 3, or maybe in both, you talked about limitations in a forward-looking way, right? Like, so you're kind of forecasting what may be potential limitations. And now that you've conducted the study, they want you to talk about what actually ended up being limitations, or what actually ended up posing problems. So you can go back to your chapter 1 or your chapter 3 and see if those things that you thought might have been limitations actually ended up being limitations, or maybe there were ones that you didn't foresee. Anyway, so you need to, and limitations or weaknesses or shortcomings that may have affected your results, right? So a big limitation for quantitative studies is a low sample size, right? If your study was underpowered, your sample was too low, that affects the statistical certainty of your findings, right? So you want to mention that. It doesn't mean everything, your study's bad or anything. It just means that the results that I've been discussing in the previous section, we may have to interpret that with a little bit of caution because, the sample size was low and the study was underpowered. You usually want to discuss also in this section how your study results will generalize to the larger study population. And there's things that affect that, and one being your sample size. So if your sample size, you have an adequate sample size, your study was sufficiently powered. For quant studies like that have the adequate sample size, your findings should generalize pretty well, especially if you use something like random sampling, which also increases the odds, the chances that your results will generalize. For qualitative studies, your results are not meant to generalize. That's by design. By design, qualitative studies have low sample sizes because usually they involve interviews, right? So you can't interview 50 people. It's just way too much. And it's not necessary anyway. So say you interviewed 10 people, that's a low sample size. But by design, it's by design because qualitative studies are meant to get in-depth information through those interviews, those in-depth interviews that quantitative studies with large samples you can't get. But that's just something you probably want to note in this section, that although the findings from your qual study with the low sample size won't generalize, they're not meant to. But what they are meant to do is provide insight based on detailed and in-depth information from your participants. Okay, and sometimes limitations with qualitative studies involve things like researcher bias. Maybe you're in the sector or industry or profession that you're studying, and maybe you're close to it. So researcher bias can sometimes be a limitation, and there's ways to prevent that or mitigate that. If you did any of those things, you would want to talk about them here. Sometimes you can't get the sample, the people, you can't interview the people you wanted to, or you had to change, samples, or same with quantitative. If you couldn't, maybe you had to use a proxy group. Anything like that might be a limitation. Okay, and again, always, when you're looking at these samples for all sections, you're going to have ideas for how people have addressed these sections in the past. Usually there's a section called something like, again, use your template to see what it says, implications for practice. And this is just like it sounds. It's so you gather this data, right? You got this data, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, and you analyze it and you have the results, right? Okay, so what is it? What do we do with it, right? Okay. Part of it is you discussed it, right? You talked about it, what it means. But then how can we use it? How is it valuable, right? Well, one thing it's valuable to is practice, right? So if you conducted an education study, who might that, of course, it obviously depends on what you did specifically, but who might that information be valuable to? Well, it can be valuable to teachers. It can be valuable to administrators, students, maybe even parents. So this is a place to talk about how your findings might inform people at the level of practice, right, for what they do. Let's just say this is an example, you conducted a study in education, and it was about why special education teachers leave the profession. There's a high rate of attrition in special education, and you wanted to study why they're leaving. Well, who would that information be valuable to? Well, obviously special educators themselves, right? But administration, right? It would be really valuable to administration to see why these teachers are leaving, because then administration, principals, supers, supervisors, they could then, oh, okay, this is why they're leaving. Then they could, that would help them divide, I'm sorry, not divide, develop policies or develop practices or develop professional development or whatever, to keep teachers in the profession. So what do your findings mean for professionals in the field? Professionals at the level of practice. That's what this section's about. And you can kind of get nuts and bolts here too, like, does it mean that you should run seminars or professional development activities or things like that? I mean, you can kind of get nuts and bolts, but it should be based on what you found. They're not general implications for practice. They're implications for practice based on what you found. Okay, recommendations for further research. So the other way that your information from your study is valuable, it's valuable to practitioners, but it's also valuable to researchers, right? How might your, or how does your, the information you found contribute to the research? Does it mean that researchers should rethink how they approach a topic, or does it give them information that was missing in the research before? Part of this includes recommendations for further research. So again, these are not general recommendations. It's based on what you found. What do you recommend that researchers focus on moving forward? They're largely based on your findings, but they can be based on limitations as well. So for example, recommendations for further research based on limitations. Let's say that you did conduct a quantitative study, you did have a low sample size. That was a limitation. You can recommend that researchers replicate the study, right? Redo the study, but they ensure that they get that ample or that adequate sample size. Any findings, recommendations for further research based on findings include generally any findings of yours that don't support previous research, that are kind of at odds to previous research. Again, that implies or suggests inconclusiveness about the topic. So you could recommend just further research on it, right? Because things are still kind of unanswered or inconclusive. Any findings that are unexpected or new or novel definitely warrant further exploration, right? You can also recommend different types of studies with different designs that are meant to get different kinds of information. So let's say you conducted that study on nutrition and special education teachers, and you just did interviews. You did a straight up qualitative study and did interviews, but you found that you found some pieces to the puzzle, but not all of them, right? So still kind of the picture is kind of incomplete. Well, you can recommend like a case study, right? A case study is, where you look at one school holistically or a couple schools holistically, and you look at, a lot of case studies, in short, have multiple data sources. They can involve interviews, they can involve classroom observations, they can involve a survey. So to get a more comprehensive view of the topic, you could recommend like a case study, right? Let's just say you conducted a quantitative study, it led you to some pretty interesting findings, but if you wanted to recommend that we dig into this topic deeper, you can recommend qualitative studies on it. Okay, so different kinds of research designs you can recommend too. But when you recommend something, always kind of put why, right? Don't just recommend it, just recommend, also talk a little bit about why and what kind of information that could be helpful. And here we are at the summary. So yeah, I mean, obviously this is kind of general, and it's kind of kind of a basic kind of introduction and guide to the chapter. But yeah, here those are the big parts. And here we're at the summary again. And check your school's template, because some schools let you in at the recommendations for further research section. So check your template, see if they want a summary or a conclusion, or if you can end with the previous section. And just like any summary, you want to recap major points from a chapter, right? But also, since this is the summary to the dissertation and not just a chapter, right? You want to leave the reader with a take-home message, right? And so that's basically, the most important aspects of your study you want them to remember, right? You want to sell, right? Sell the importance of your study, right? You did a lot of work, you got some good information, sell what you found here in the summary, right? With the take-home message. And that is it. I'm going to get to questions here in a minute. I'm going to leave this up while we talk. This is who we are. This is our contact information. We provide a range of services. So, I mean, if you're interested in talking to someone, obviously no obligations, just to get information, feel free. Also, feel free to poke around the website. We have resources there. We have this webinar is archived. Other webinars are archived on different chapters and different aspects of the dissertation and the study. So feel free to just kind of look around at the website. And okay, questions. I think I already have a couple. Let's see. Okay, here's a question. Is it possible to get a draft that follows the steps in discussing the findings of a study? We do have templates, I believe, right, Sierra? I don't know if those are available on our website. They may be. It's not steps exactly, but it's kind of a template that gives you the headers and a little bit of description about what goes into the sections. So that could be helpful to you. How do we write a discussion for mixed methods? Everything is similar for mixed methods. That's a good question. It kind of depends. Sometimes mixed methods have, how should I say it? Sometimes they're mostly quantitative, and then they'll have a qualitative portions that helps explain the quant portion, or vice versa. They'll have it's mainly qualitative, and then they'll have a quantitative portion that asks some questions that will illuminate the other portion. So if your study is mostly one thing, I would probably focus on that and then bring in like the findings from the other portion to help kind of clarify some of the points. If your study is kind of equally weighted, qualitative, quantitative, you may have to discuss the findings. I mean, there's kind of two ways to do it. You can split the findings, or you can kind of discuss them together. I think it might be easier to kind of split them and then kind of come back and then, make some kind of conclusion where you talk about what they mean together. But yeah, for mixed methods, to some degree, you're going to have to talk about both of the findings, whether that's, you focus on one more than the other. That's kind of just determines about how much weight you put on one methodology, one design, as opposed to the other one. Okay. All right. Okay. Any other questions? No other questions? Okay, everybody. Well, let's see. Okay, great. Thank you, Sarah. All right. If everybody's good with the chapter 5, I wish you luck. Again, you're near the end. That's good. There's still a little more work to do to clear that hurdle, but if you're close or at the chapter 5, congratulations. Okay, thank you, everybody, and good luck in the future, and happy holidays. Thank you.